Hi everybody, John Carver for FlyRodFanatic.com here, and it's time to talk about applying epoxy to our guides here, to the thread that's holding them in place. And so what we've done since the last video is I've put 2 coats of color preservative on each one of these wraps, and that color preservative has soaked into the wraps. It's going to prevent the epoxy from soaking into them to the point that, it'll significantly change the color. Right now we're using this really awesome olive colored thread that blends with the blank so nice. I've already epoxied some of it. I've left these 2 stripper guides here so that we could do that on camera, and I could show you how. They're the largest ones that we have to work with here. So let's talk about what we're going to use. As far as the equipment that I have here, I've got my rod turner here so that during the drying process it's constantly turning. You don't have to use a turner, and a lot of people don't. A lot of folks will just put the epoxy on, and they'll have to tend it. They'll have to maybe turn it 180 degrees every 10 minutes or so until the epoxy starts to dry. And in reality, doing it that way is actually kind of good because it makes you extra sensitive to getting too much epoxy on your thread wraps, which is really a big problem. Okay, so taking a look at the equipment that I'm going to use here. I will be using a rod turner, and I have my 2-part rod epoxy. Now this is light build. There's heavy build and light build. Usually for fly rods, I just use the light build. If you've already gone out and purchased yourself some high build, not a big deal. That works fine. The lighter build, though, is typically more appropriate for some of the smaller, delicate wraps that you end up doing up towards the tip of the rod. So I'm just going to use that. We use this 2-part light build epoxy, and typically you'd put 2 coats on there. There are people out there that have lots of problems with epoxy, and they try all different brands trying to find that epoxy that goes on perfectly. Well, no brand is really better than the next, in my opinion, from at least the ones that I've tried. What really matters is that it be mixed well, and that you have exactly 50-50 parts in that mixture, and then some type of a heat source, such as, I'll use this torch to get rid of any bubbles that might be under the epoxy as you're putting it on. So the most important thing is that you just mix it well. So what I'm going to do now is let's go ahead and get started. We'll zoom the camera in close here so you can see everything as I do it. Okay, so I'm actually going to put a cup down on a nice sturdy level surface here, and I'm going to actually get down on my knees so that I can look at it and see the little marks in there so that I can see how much I'm putting in. I'm typically going to stop pouring just before it gets there and let it settle before I put in the next part there. Now one thing you can do is you can warm these up. You can put them in some warm water. You can just put them in your pocket and warm them up a little bit. It'll be a little bit easier to pour and measure at that point. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and pour in 1 dram. Use whatever measurement you want, really. I'm going to stop pouring before it gets to that mark. I need a little bit more. Now if this is really thick, it's not pouring very well. You may create a little mountain in there, and you may be getting a false reading. So you want to make sure that this is nice and runny. And then, there are times when you might want to just tap this down. Make sure that you have an accurate measurement there. Now, one of these is labeled Hardener, and some people make the mistake of thinking, well, I want this to be a really hard finish here, so I'm going to put in a little more hardener. Well, that is one of the most common mistakes definitely do not do that. What you'll end up with is you'll end up with wraps that are like permanently gummy. They'll never harden all the way. So now I'm going to go ahead and put in the second measurer so that the level comes up to 2 drams. And it comes right up to the line. That's perfect. Okay, so I have the appropriate amount, exactly 50-50 equal parts. And now I'm just going to start stirring this up. Now, when it comes to stirring your epoxy, the beginning rod builder, perhaps you've heard something about, you don't want any bubbles in your finish, Well, when you start stirring this, you can't help but aerate it a little bit. So yeah, bubbles are going to form in here. It's no big deal. Don't worry about the bubbles. The most important thing is that this be mixed. Okay, so don't try to go really slow and not form bubbles. Don't sweat it. Mix the heck out of this. And do this for a good, 2 or 3 minutes. Make sure that this is just mixed extremely well. Now, it'll be full of bubbles. I mean, it'll just be absolutely full of bubbles. And a lot of people, what some people do is they'll take some tin foil and they'll put the tin foil down a piece of wood or on a paper plate or something like that. And they'll pour their epoxy from this mixing cup out onto that surface. And as it flattens out, a lot of bubbles just pop right then and there. But I just apply it right out of this cup. Because the action of applying this, you're going to pop most of the bubbles. Whatever bubbles might exist in your wraps, all you have to do is take a heat source. Some people use an alcohol burner. Some people use a torch or even a lighter. And all you have to do is superheat that air right around the wrap. And then the higher pressure air inside that bubble comes to the surface and pops the bubble. So what's really important is that you have excellent lighting. You've got to have really good lighting because the light will refract off the walls of the bubbles in your wrap there if you have any, and allow you to address those before it hardens too much. Nothing's more frustrating than coming back to a cured rod and finding that there's a couple bubbles in there. So at this point, I have just mixed this extremely well. It is full of bubbles. Almost looks like whipped cream. It's so full of bubbles. So I'm just going to get rid of the excess here, and I'm going to just set it down here, tap it a little bit, let it sit for just a minute or two. I don't want to let it sit for too long. I need to start putting this on the rod relatively quickly. Another reason for using the light build epoxy is typically you'll have a longer pot life or working life. That means it'll stay runny longer so you can get it on those wraps. Once this begins to harden up, and you'll be able to tell, you need to stop putting it on your wraps, because once it starts getting too hard, it'll never level out in the turning process, and you'll end up with what we typically refer to as a footballed wrap. A big hump of epoxy that is not concentric, around the rod shaft. So let's go ahead and get a fresh brush out here and start the epoxying process.